Good morning and welcome. I'm so glad that all of you are here in person and online. And we're going to talk about ways in which we can use protest music as a way of teaching our students about ethical concepts for different categories. So mine's focus is more on social work because that's the area in which I work, but it can be applied to any area. And ultimately what I'd like to do with this piece is to move it forward to creating an actual musical that would then teach ethics as well. And so this is kind of my starting point as opposed to being an end product. And so I welcome all suggestions and feedback from folks in the room as well as online. So we'll go ahead and jump into this. So we're here as ethics fellows with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And a lot of our social work ethics align very closely with the principles that go along with the initiative. And so when we talk about integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability are all the things that in social work and in our ethical practices, we engage with our clients in that way. But when we think about protest music, do we always think about these things lying somewhere in the language that's used or in the lyrics that are used within that music? And I don't know that we've always have done that. So I grew up in a household that listened to a number of genres of music. So there was no one set type of music that we listened to. Everybody had their choices and we listened to all of it. And so I became somebody to listen more so to the lyrics first. And then I listen to the melodies and the chords and everything that's playing so that I can experience the music rather than just hearing the music. And that became very important to me over my lifetime. So what we're going to do today is kind of use those concepts in a way for us to discuss how can we make it a tool for teaching ethics. So we're going to look at our social work principles. So social work principles start here with service, social justice, the dignity and worth of a person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and confidence. And with those principles, we then walk into our social work values, and these are the values that line up with the principles of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And so what we see here as part of service is that we help people in need to address social problems. That's what we do as social workers. We challenge injustice so that that makes us involved in social justice. So when it's wrong, right, we want to make it a right. We respect the inherent dignity and worth of a person. So every person has a right to basic human needs to be met here on this planet and for their voices to be heard. They have a right to opportunity. And so as social workers, we make sure that in our work, we're promoting that. Recognizing the central importance of human relationships. So none of us is put on this earth to live in isolation. We're all put here to live communally. We're all put here to live in connection with someone else, and that is to include our earth, right? So we live in connection with the earth and other human beings. So recognizing as social workers, we recognize that relationships are important. And without those relationships, it makes it a lot harder to move forward. And when we talk about protests, we generally see protests happening in groups where people have found a connection amongst themselves against a particular cause and what's important to them. And we behave in a trustworthy manner. If we're not being honest and transparent with the people that we're trying to work with, then we're violating an ethical expectation that we're going to work with you. I can't lie to you and then say that I'm going to work with you, because then the trust is dissolved and you won't allow me in. And oftentimes when we talk about Indigenous people, you have to gain the trust in order to come into that community. Without that trust, they will not allow you into that community. You're an outsider coming in. So we need to make sure that we're behaving in a trustworthy manner. And finally, that we're practicing within our scope of competence. And so we don't want to go into somebody's movement and say, yes, I can do this. And we have no clue. We have no ability, right? That's the difference sometimes between allyship and taking over, is that we come in with whatever our area expertise is, but it may not align with what the goals of the movement is. And so we have to be very careful that in going into a movement, going into a protest, that we're bringing the skills and competencies that complement what's happening there and not operating outside of the scope of that practice. So what we're going to look at in how we're going to use music to address the exploration of ethics is that we're going to use some ethical standards. So within social work, we have ethical standards, and then within those standards, there are other pieces that further defines what that standard means or what the expectation is within that standard. Now, that's a lot of information, and I'm not going to share all of that with you today in the time that we have. And so I've listed the six standards, and what we're going to do is focus on the two that are starred. So we have social workers' ethical responsibility to our clients, and that looks at what are we responsible for to our clients? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to treat them? What do we need to consider? And then it goes on to our colleagues, and working with our colleagues, it looks at how do we respect our colleagues? How do we assist our colleagues? How do we engage with our colleagues? And when our colleagues are in trouble, how do we assist them so that they do no harm to the clients that we serve? So those two can often tie into each other when we have an impaired colleague and things need to be addressed. We have an ethical responsibility to our practice setting. So wherever it is that we are engaging in social work practice, we have an obligation to them to present ourselves as respectful, and respectful of that agency, following and adhering to whatever the mission and vision is for that agency, as well as the policies and guidelines. We also have an obligation, again, right, to our clients that if within those agencies, there are some things that are problematic, we have an obligation to challenge those if they would in some way harm the clients that we are serving. We have an ethical responsibility to the profession. So we should give back. And so oftentimes social workers will do seminars and often offer CEUs for free in a lot of cases, because that's part of us giving back. And so providing that education in addition to getting education for ourselves as part of our responsibility to the professionals. For the professionals, working with them, and that is to also include our students. So when we have interns, we have an obligation to our interns to make sure that they are learning what they need to learn and that they are becoming competent social work practitioners. And then lastly, we have an ethical responsibility to the broader society. And so whatever it is that we do, we have to make sure that we can make an impact, not just locally, not just on a micro level, but even looking at globally, how can we make an impact in our world? And we have a responsibility to do that. And a lot of times that comes out in the form of social justice. All right, so let's talk about Indigenous for a second. And so earlier I had a conversation and the assumption was that I was talking about Native American or people indigenous to the United States or North America, which yes, that is an indigenous people. But when we talk about indigenous, I want us to think a little bit more broadly on that and not leave it exclusively to our folks who are First Nations people or indigenous to North America. I want us to expand that to our communities. So when we think about indigenous people and we're looking at them in their totality. So communities, nations, federal, provincial, right? The families, the individual, and all of these things that come in to affect them, saying that being indigenous is not simply if I was on this land first, it's saying, was I part of this community first? Is this community something that's exclusive to me? So when we look at our folks living in rural America, those are communities that are indigenous to the land that they're on, correct? Because they have developed a community, they've developed a culture, they've developed a way of living, and they have a greater understanding of what's significant and important to them that we will never have because we do not live in rural America. Well, maybe some of you do, I don't live in rural America, right? And so let's think for instance, we know that the cicadas are coming in droves. Well, probably not to Colorado, but to our southern eastern side of the map of North America is where they're going to see it the most. And what it's going to take for folks to deal with that is going to be very different from what it's going to take for us here in Colorado Springs to deal with the coming of the cicadas. So we have to think of indigenous in different ways now, because the plight of people does not exclusively happen to people who are First Nations in any country. That we're seeing plights happen all across our world to different types of people. So recognizing that Indigenous is, and this would kind of make you think more of like fruits and vegetables, because we know that there are some that are indigenous to the lands where they grow, but people grow in environments, and that makes them indigenous to those environments, right? Kind of thinking about that dignity and worth of a person and recognizing the environments that they're growing in allows us to see them in a very different way than maybe we had seen them before. And then also the more common definition is what we have here of people being the earliest inhabitants of a particular place that maybe became colonized by a non-dominant group. But did we only see that with Native Americans in North America? We've seen it a lot. We continue to see it through issues of institutional racism, that there's still dominant groups that will oppress folks in our country who are indigenous to the areas that they're in. Protest music. Okay, so what is protest music, right? Generally, protest music is something that is going to speak to a cause. Music that has been generated to speak to something or against something for a particular group of people. And oftentimes, famous people will be the ones that sing the song because it brings more attention to the cause than just that community or that group who's protesting can bring to it. And so it elevates the awareness. But why is it important that we have protest music, and what is its role? So what we see in protest music is that it can sometimes be the voice that's heard when the voice can't be heard. It speaks to our hearts and our souls, and it causes us to think. At least that's what it should do. That's what it's intended to do. It's to cause us to think. So think about how music alone impacts us. And when we think about how music impacts us, we then start to get a better understanding, at least for me, a better understanding of what protest music does for us. And this is one way that we want to engage our students in a way so that they can begin to experientially understand the folks that they're working with. And so the song is going to come up, and I'll tell you what it is if you don't already know it. Some of you may already know it, but I'll tell you, it is a protest song, but I'll tell you what it is afterwards. And because there's some things that I want you to think about when you're listening to this piece. Okay. What you think about while you're listening, can music have a positive or negative role in our disposition towards or performance of right or wrong acts, our duties, and our virtues? Can it make a difference to us morally when we hear music? And can musical experiences make us better or worse from a moral point of view? What are your thoughts? John Coltrane, Alabama. Anybody familiar with that?
Never really considered protest songs to be instrumental. Like they're for me, they're very lyric driven. But I can definitely see some connections between other songs from the time period, like Baltimore. I know it by through Nina Simone, and even still something like Strange Fruit. Yeah.
And if you look at protest songs, Strange Fruit is kind of one that's listed. And when we talk about outside of Indigenous protest music, as kind of like the first one. Yeah, because it was the one that brought about a lot of attention that some would say led to her demise in a lot of ways, right? I mean, outside of her own behaviors, but her career-wise. So Alabama was a piece that John Coltrane did after the bombing of the First Baptist Church in Birmingham, which killed 4 young girls, and the bombing was done by white supremacists. And so after King's eulogy in that funeral, this piece was created to go along with the cadence of how the eulogy was expressed. And so sometimes protests don't actually speak the words, but it asks us to feel so that then our thoughts are changed, right? That cognitive piece will kick in because we're experiencing it in a very different way. And so we may be at a jazz club and hear Alabama, But if we don't know the history, right, we don't know, kind of like you said, Monica, you experience it very differently when you know, oh, this is what this is, right? So can music change how we think morally? What do y'all think? Can it impact how we think morally? And the virtues that we hold, could they be different when we engage or experience the music of a community? And that's kind of where this is all going, right? Is for us to have these opportunities with our students to have them experience ethics in a very different way that is going to, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's going to allow them to do some self-reflection and some critical thinking around issues that they maybe never thought about in that way. And so music can be moral thought. Oftentimes it's easier to understand when we have the lyrics, but when we dig into the history of certain songs, we then also get it through it being just instrumental. And that was my whole point in using the Coltrane song. Music and value. So music is valuable to us because it brings all of us an experience when we hear it. I don't know that you could ever meet a single person on this planet that would say, oh my God, I hate music. Right? It's just never gonna happen. We hate certain genres of music, or we have a distaste for them, right? But nobody ever not like music. And why is that? Because music speaks to us in a way that words don't always do it. Music speaks to us in a way that people can't always do it, even though it's people providing us with the music, right? But we can connect in a very different way. So it's valuable to that, and it helps us in some ways recognize our values. Think about a bad breakup. And how you maybe really wanted to get back at that person, or you wanted their lives to be horrible after that bad breakup, right? And so you listen to the song that tunes into that value you're having at that time. Oh, I want them to suffer. And so you listen to, like, what is this, a Black Widow song, and it talks about how, you know, I'm gonna do something to you and eat you and all of that stuff, right? And there's all of these songs that talk about it, right? But then we move into a place of our healing. And the songs that we then start to listen to are less about revenge and more about uplifting ourselves, right? Because our values have shifted and our views about that relationship, that we're no longer looking at it as the worst thing that ever happened to us, but it hurts and it's okay. And so then we begin to even value ourselves in a very different way. And we're no longer going, well, what did I do? And why wasn't I the right one? And we're saying, you know what? I'm everything to everybody, and I don't need to be that to you if I'm not enough. And so we listen to the songs that tell us that we are enough, right? The music is valuable in that way, and our values will shift with the music. Our emotions, again. We can be angry, and we put on the angry music, or we can be angry and know that we need to calm down, and so we put on the music that calms us. Puts us in a better place. We know the day was really hard, and so we get in the car and we put on whatever radio station or CD or playlist, a CD. I just dated myself with that one. Or playlist that works for us, right? So that between home and work, we can let go of some of that stuff that was really rough. We recognize the emotions in it, or we hear the song and it brings tears, it brings memory, right? So all of these things are very important for us to help our students to use this as a tool that they're already engaged in, right? They're already into music, but here's just another way for them to use it. It's through ethics, helping them to understand that there is an ethics to music, but music can also help us understand ethics and bringing those two together. So music is a teaching tool. It encourages exploration of other topics, cultures, and things that we don't really know about, right? And so if you have never listened to bluegrass, you won't ever know about the folks and their experiences in the South or in a more rural area, right? I have never been around what might be called deep rural South. I've been in the South, but not deep rural South. But I have a small glimpse into what that might be like through music. I've never been to the Appalachian Mountains, but have a small sense of what that might be like. And we have all of us, okay, if you hear the banjo playing, right? Right, what comes to mind, right? We think of what Hollywood showed us those folks in the Appalachian Mountains should be. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So this is this impact, right? That it's such a great impact that even the media uses it to impact what we buy, what we watch, and how we respond to things. So why not use it for our students with ethics? So that we're bringing up these folks in our professions that look at people in such a way to say, you know what, even though I had never met them, I'm gonna get to know them through their music. And that it engages all of our senses. So we're not just being cognitive about what we're doing, we're feeling it. So we got the emotions going, and we're thinking about it from an emotional perspective. We are thinking about it from an experiential perspective because we can put ourselves in their shoes in this way, right? So we engage all of our multiple intelligences at one time to really look at a culture and a movement of a people to better understand them. And where does our ethics come in on that? Right? So if we are talking about business, and if we were saying, okay, and I'm using redlining as an example because I teach a course and we're talking about that right now. So that's what's at the front of my mind. And so we talk about redlining, and I am from the dominant culture. I don't understand redlining because it doesn't happen to me, but I hear music. I can better understand what the plight of it is, right? And I might still not believe that redlining is a thing, but I hear this music and I say, but people aren't being treated fairly in some way. And ethically, as a banker, I don't want to be that person. So I'm going to work in such a way that I don't go with the status quo because it spoke to me in that way, right? And so we help them to be better in what they do by exploring and using those multiple learning intelligence that they have. A greater understanding, like I said earlier, through self-reflection. Who am I in all of this space? What are my beliefs? What are my morals? What are my virtues? Because sometimes my morals don't line up with the code of ethics for whatever profession I'm in. And I need to explore that because an ethical violation for my profession could lead to the end of my profession, right? My moral understanding could be the end of some parts of my character if I don't follow that. And that becomes a challenge. And so using music to help our students address these ethical dilemmas that will come up for them. Because our moral doesn't always match up with the ethical standards that are put out by our professions. And then again, I've said this over and over again, that experience. Being able, we know it's there, but now let me experience a little bit of that so that I have an understanding of it. And that experience leads me into maybe more cognitive motions and thoughts about how this thing is impacting people and how is it connected to my ethics. And I feel a little bit different about how I'm going through the problem solving process. That I'm not just checking the boxes and I'm really considering some of these other things that play a part in this. Okay, so here's a playlist of Indigenous protest music. So we have Universal Soldier by Buffy St. Marie in 1964. And that was protest music that was put out to look at soldiers who were going into the Vietnam War and really recognizing not just the war, but there were human bodies going into this war and being affected. And a lot of her work is around Indigenous people. And this is one of her pieces. And when I say Indigenous, First Nations, Native American people, this is a piece that she did around the idea of the war. And let's really look at the bodies and the sacrifices that go into that. Machine Gun, Jimi Hendrix, also a piece about the Vietnam War and protest of it. John Lennon, Imagine. Again, another song about the Vietnam War, but that one also came with the idea of hope and peace, that we could move into another space. So it didn't just protest the war, but also kind of wanted to usher us emotionally into a place of believing that things could be different. Hurricane by Bob Dylan. This was in protest of the wrongful incarceration of Hurricane Carter, a boxer who was accused of killing a man in a club one night. And he didn't do it, but he went to jail for it. And so Bob Dylan wrote a song in protest of his arrest and incarceration. Born in the USA. I love this one because, right, we have folks playing it and it's not even what they mean. I love it. They always listen to the chorus and never the lyrics. I love it, right? But he's talking about those middle class workers, right? As everyday folks and the struggle that they had, in addition to what was happening to Vietnam vets when they came back from the war and the mistreatment that they experienced, right? Born in the USA, like it just rings in my head. Plus, I'm a Jersey girl. Stop the Violence, Boogie Down Productions, rap group that talked about violence in the inner cities and wanted to have something done about the gun violence that was taking folks out in the 80s, late 80s. Fight the Power by Public Enemy, another rap group that was talking about standing up to the establishment and particularly those systems that systematically oppress people within Black and Brown communities. And it was featured in the Spike Lee movie, Do the Right Thing, where you saw this clash of those systems. And so you had working class folks who were oppressed, but still held some racist views in a community where they were then oppressing the people in that community, right? It was just a cyclical thing that was going on. Bombs Over Baghdad by John Trudell. And we think, right? Yeah, because the Iraq War, not really. Bombs over Baghdad had more to do with what was going on at home and the unfair treatments that was happening there. And then there was a rendition of a Bombs Over Baghdad by the group Outkast. And that one talked also about unfair treatment that was happening at home, but from the perspective, again, of racial discrimination. And then lastly, I have on this list, This Is America by Childish Gambino. And it's a protest song about how the entertainment, it's a lot going on in this song. A lot. But, you know, the use of guns and violence in entertainment. And then also there was the idea of systematic or institutional oppression and racism. And there is lots going on in that song. And so you watch the video, you can kind of get lost in everything that's going on and you kind of forget what's happening. So you have to kind of like, don't watch the video. To just listen to it or read the lyrics so you really engage. But this is just a little playlist I put together of some songs, and there are a whole lot more out there. But these are the things that we can use with our students. And again, I went away from the traditional idea of indigenous people of North America, because we have to begin from an ethical standpoint. We have an ethical obligation, right? To look at these folks outside that are not what would be typically considered Indigenous people. We still work for the rights of our Indigenous people. We want to work with them and serve them in an ethical way from the different professions that we're in, but we can't forget about these other folks as well. And they need to be included in that idea of Indigenous people. All right, so this again just kind of shows you a crossover. I spoke to this already, and so again, right, we're focusing on social work ethical responsibility to clients and our ethical responsibility to the broader society. And I mentioned, right, inside of each of our standards, we have more detailed ideas of what it is that we should be doing. And so one of them is with that commitment to client is that their our primary responsibility and their well-being is paramount. And self-determination is that we work with our clients so that they can reach their goals, not our goals, right? It has to be what is it that they want, and we work with them to do that. And so I think collectively, when we think about ethics in any profession that we're in, there should be some participation for the people that we serve. That we're not just making up the rules or making up the end game for them. And then the cultural competence piece is that we should be aware of the people that we're working with, and culturally, what things are important to them? How do they operate in this world? How do they view the world, right? What's their worldview on this? And through our interactions with them, come to an understanding, not to change, but to understand and assist and use the strengths that come along with the cultures that they belong to. And when we talk about broader society, we're talking about social welfare. I mentioned earlier, right? Not just that in the place that we live, but we're looking local to global. How can we impact the world ethically in a way, or help our students learn to impact the world in an ethical way that is going to make improvement for everybody, right? In the best way that we can. And public participation is that as social workers, we're to engage in these protests. And we should encourage our students on all levels in every profession to engage in the causes that are important to the people that we're serving. all of us are coming out of our professions serving somebody what's important to them, and we should engage in those concerns. And then social and political action to change policies that disenfranchise the folks that we serve as well, right? That we want to make change within our social and political arenas. So I'm gonna play some music again, and I want you to think of these things: commitment to clients, self-determination, cultural competency. And think of it in terms of what it means to your profession, and then we're gonna ask some questions afterwards, okay? Because this is the way I envision kind of teaching our students. They're social work students, and so we all focus around this. But you kind of have to fit it in the context of where you work and the area that you're in, so that it makes a little bit more sense for you in usefulness. And so we'll go ahead and play this. An engagement part. When we think about commitment to the client, who's the client in this music? Who we identify as the client?
Two ways. I think it could be all of us listening, the listener. Also be the people who are creating the situation.
Any other thoughts?
Based on Marvin Gaye's approach, in that it's not like it's still in like his smooth jazz kind of style. I think he's trying to engage people who aren't already talking about climate crisis, and he's trying to like bridge a connection between people to get more people aware of what is going on.
My social work perspective, right? The client in that one would be our environment, the ecosystems, right? Because he's letting us know what's happening in those places. But to both of your points, correct, because we need to make the people aware. Here's what you're doing, right? Pollution is man-made, right? So aware of what you're doing to this environment, to these indigenous things, right? Pollution, the air, the water, radiation, everything, right? And then when we think about self-determination, if we use the members of the environment, animals have a hard time expressing what their self-determination. If we look at it from the perspective, even plants, if we look at it from the perspective of how we understand them and how they flourish, what their needs are, right? We then can see that they have a right to that basic, even though they can't articulate. Beings in the environment, we can articulate what our goals would be for it, and would say, we don't want the radiation, we don't want the in the air, we don't want the pollution, lower emissions, and all of the things that we talk about now, which is that always goes on to still talk when that song came. And so helping our students to see, right, what, and again, from a social work perspective, but what using your own ethics, what that means in terms of self-determination, and that our environment has a right to flourish, right, even though it can't speak. And then the culture, and that's where we understand the ecosystems that each of these things are operating in, what our ecosystems look like, what our plants' ecosystems look like. That's part of that cultural competency, because they can't tell us, right? But we do know, at least, okay, I was told that you don't plant certain things together because they can't flourish. Or if you have, I believe it is a citrus tree, you have to have a male and a female, right? Because the ecosystem requires it, or is it? So apple trees, they need a male and a female to flourish, right? So that environment, that's part of their culture to survive, is that they have to flourish, and that they need that. And we have to understand that, and that becomes, even from an environmental perspective, understanding that. But then we look at the people and we talk about, what's the culture around this pollution? Well, where do we typically find high pollutant areas? Where our poor people. That's where we find it, right? So understand the culture of that, you know what, this land or this house has been in my family for 100 years, right? And we've lived in this particular part of town or in a rural area generations, and there's no debt on this house. Don't make much money. Why would I move? even though I know you're spilling stuff into my water. Right, so I have to fight you on that one because it's a whole lot cheaper to fight you on that one. And maybe not get the cancer, or maybe not get whatever, right? Than it is to pick up my entire life and generations, my culture, and move it. Right, so helping our students to understand that.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's interesting, I noticed, I had to look it up, 1971, and it's still relevant today.
Yeah.
But also, because when I teach the sustainability or sustainable business type of things in our business class, a lot of things that turned on business, and even today, is that, you know, doomsday and really, you know, and this was quite, it was very subliminal, you know, and it was actually, it was just saying it's not like it used to be, you know, so it was more nostalgic about,
Yeah.
you know, like caring. It was a great example. I'm gonna use it in my class.
Yay, excellent, yeah, I sat and I listened to it and I listened to it, because I went through different songs and like, what am I gonna use today, what am I gonna use today? And I said, you know what, this one. And it is one that requires you to listen, and it evokes the emotion, it evokes the cognitive, right? It has us engaging all of our senses, because I think about it and I say, you know, the radiation underground, and it makes me think of, gosh, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then, so we bought a house last year and it was like, oh, did you check the radon? I'm like, what? Check the radon. The worst thing I had was like play dirt when I was in Arkansas. I don't understand. So all of these things, right? And how you can move into a neighborhood and not know what might be underneath your ground, right? Or what, and is it lead pipes or not? I don't know. Right? I mean, they do a check, but and the bigger scheme of things, and what does all of that mean? And then you think like Flint, Michigan, how many years have these people been ingesting something? The city should have, and they didn't. Insane, right? Okay. So we'll go to the next one. And this one is Occupy Wall Street protest song, The Bottom 99. And this one, this piece is done more in the style of what's called plain style. And so the protest music that we will hear from Indigenous people in their native language is what we often hear called plain style, because it's from that area, living on the plains and how they would chant and put out their protest music. So this one is it's not in another language, it's in English, but it's done the same in that style of plain style. But we're thinking again, right? Here we are in our largest society, social welfare, public participation, and social political action. Some of us remember Occupy Wall Street once.
I remember it.
What are our thoughts when we talk about social welfare and this particular song? What comes to mind for you? Thoughts, feelings?
Frustration of feeling that you're not part of the, not getting the benefit of the economy, and that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I think that's a little bit today, you know, where people are feeling like they can't, you know, they have to choose between, you know, feeding their family and paying the rent, you know, things like that.
And our elderly certainly do it all the time.
I would build on this is that I think currently a lot of people don't realize that the rich are getting richer and they are getting poorer. And that call to action, like people listen to my song, that really, I think so many of us realize what's actually happening.
Just what you said, made that connection. And for me, listening to it evoked this, ooh, okay. And then, and visually, what I got in my mind was what I remember seeing tents, right? People pitching tents and occupying Wall Street. And then I thought about our homeless camps here in Denver. And my brain just kind of like, right, was how is this different? Right? And how is it the same? And so, and I'll say this in conclusion, is really, I think, I still have to build on this concept of using the protest music in the classroom, and so kind of tweaking and ultimately, like I said, it ending up as a musical. And initially, I was just kind of thinking a musical that, because it had been done before, right? And so it disappeared, and I wanted to revive that. And so just a musical. And then I thought about the use of protest music and how much more that can do for us in terms of connecting us with people in the classroom that we might not get a chance to connect with outside of the classroom, and just really bringing a different lens. And so we've heard about the use of critical race theory and erasing all of that stuff, right? And so in this particular course that deals with racial, social, economic, and environmental justice, here's a way for you to really immerse yourself in it. And that was kind of from even the research is what I got. One article talked about the immersion of students who were learning it. Well, they call it EFL, I call it ESL. So English is a second language. And so what they did was not only do an immersion program with them, which we know a lot of students struggle when they go into the immersion programs coming here to the United States, but they used music to help them to really understand the culture, the linguistics, and this whole list of things that these students were now getting and thriving off of. And I thought, why can't we do it with that? To help them help them be immersed into some cultures, into some situations that they might not see or experience on their own for whatever reason. It could be a lack of access, lack of ability, lack of interest, right? But we make you interested through a venue that you already enjoy.